Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is not just one of my favorite remakes of all time, but this is also one of my favorite horror films from the 1980s, and that is The Blob. Now, this, of course, is a remake of the 1958 film of the same name, and this is technically the third film in the Blob franchise, because in between this and the original film, there was also a 1972 sequel to The Blob titled Beware the Blob. That is, if you count this as a franchise, because I don't know if you count two films and a remake as being a franchise, but if you do count the whole Blob saga, if you will, as a franchise, then this is technically the third film in the franchise. Now, the film is produced by Jack H. Harris, who also produced the first two movies. Now, the film was co-written and directed by Chuck Russell, who prior to this co-wrote and directed A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, and he would go on to direct The Mask with Jim Carrey. The movie is also co-written by Frank Darabont, who prior to this also worked on A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, and he would go on to co-write The Fly 2, and he would also go on to write and direct several Stephen King adaptations, including The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist, and he would go on to direct the first season of The Walking Dead. Now, I really love the 1988 remake of The Blob. Once again, this is one of my all-time favorite remakes. Like, this I think is one of the great remakes. Like, this is right up there with John Carpenter's The Thing and David Cronenberg's The Fly. And here's the thing, I love the original film. At the same time, I might actually like this one a little better. I'm actually not sure because, really, I like this movie and I like the original film for different reasons. And honestly, this is such a different film from the original The Blob that it's really hard to compare the two movies. And honestly, you watch the original The Blob for a different reason than you watch the remake. Like, you watch these two movies for different reasons. They're very, very different films. And one thing I think this remake does really well is it pays tribute to the original film, and it definitely pays respect to the original movie. At the same time, this is very much a creature of its own. And honestly, I think the movie does a fantastic job at updating the story for the 1980s. And while the original The Blob definitely has its place in film history, this movie in the last few years has developed a pretty big cult following. Now, the plot of The Blob is it's set in this small town called Arborville, and the movie starts following this teenage girl named Meg Penny, who's a cheerleader at the local high school, and she goes out on a date with this jock named Paul Taylor. The movie also follows this teenage boy named Brian Flagg, who is sort of like a rebel in the town, and he's also sort of an outcast in the town as well, and he has a reputation for being a delinquent. So what happens is, in the movie, this meteor lands by this small town, and this old hobo finds the meteor, and out of this meteor comes this corrosive slime that is actually alive, and the slime latches onto the old man's hand, and it literally starts dissolving his hand and starts spreading throughout his entire arm. So Brian Flagg runs into this old man, and he tries to help him, but the old man runs away, and he chases after him, and the old man runs out into the road, and Meg and Paull, who were out on a date, accidentally hit the old man with their car. And at first, Paull accuses Flagg of chasing this old man out into the road, but they end up taking the old man to the hospital, and this thing on his hand ends up spreading throughout his entire body, and it literally eats the old man. The thing then eats Paull, and Meg witnesses this thing eat Paull, and she tries to tell people about it, but of course nobody will believe her. Eventually, Brian Flagg sees this thing, and throughout the movie, the Blob is eating people in the town, and the more it eats, the bigger it gets. And now it's up to Brian and Meg to save their town. Also in the movie, this government agency gets involved with all this as well. So, the movie has the same basic premise as the original film, but of course it changes a hell of a lot, and the movie also adds a new twist to the whole Blob storyline. Because in the movie, and this is kind of a spoiler here, but in the movie you find out that this meteor that the Blob came from was actually man-made. It was made by the government as sort of a germ warfare test. It turns out that the government put bacteria inside this man-made meteor and then sent it into space, and the radiation of space somehow mutated the bacteria into this creature. So in the movie you see this biological containment team sent by the government to sort of put a lid on all this, and when they discover that this experiment has led to the creation of this creature, they now want to use the creature as a weapon. So the movie in a lot of ways sort of works as kind of a conspiracy film as well. And a lot of critics have read into how both this film and the original The Blob are sort of like perfect representations of the times they came out in. Like, in the original film, the Blob was actually an alien, and that sort of reflected the fears at the time of communism and this fear of the other or the outsider. Whereas in this film, the Blob was actually created by the United States government, which definitely speaks to society's post-Watergate views of the government. And it definitely seems to speak to how the 80s was by far a more cynical time than the 1950s. Now, that's just what a lot of critics have read into the film, but honestly, I don't think it's a bad analysis, but I'm not sure if that's what Chuck Russell and Frank Darabont were originally going for, but Frank Darabont is a smart enough writer where it would not surprise me if that is what he was originally going for. Now, besides this film's themes of government corruption, this movie also seems to have the theme of small-town life. Now, you got that a little bit in the original film, but not to the same extent as in this film, where you really do get a feel for this small town that the movie takes place in, and you really get to know the people in this town. In a lot of ways, I kind of saw a Stephen King influence on this movie, because a lot of Stephen King's stories do deal with small-town life. And the possible Stephen King influence on this movie would not surprise me, given the fact that Frank Darabont co-wrote this, and he would go on to direct some actual Stephen King adaptations. Like, the one Stephen King story that definitely seems to have an influence on this movie is Stephen King's novella The Mist, which was written before this, so it's possible that this movie could have been in some way influenced by The Mist, which is also why it's ironic that years later Frank Darabont would actually do an adaptation of The Mist. Now keep in mind that the possible Stephen King influence on this movie is pure speculation on my part. To the best of my knowledge, it's nothing that's ever been confirmed by Frank Darabont or Chuck Russell. Now, in the movie, Kevin Dillon plays the character of Brian Flagg, and he does a really good job in this movie as this character. And Flagg really is a great character, because he's like this punk. At the same time, he's actually a really good kid. Like, you get little hints that he might have a really bad home life, and he might have had a really bad life growing up, and maybe that's the reason he's the way he is. But this, like, horrific situation that happens forces him to really care about people other than himself. In the movie, Shawnee Smith plays the character of Meg Penny. Now, most people would probably know Shawnee Smith as Amanda from the Saw movies. But Shawnee Smith also does a great job as this character. And Meg really is a great character who, like Brian, I think really does go through an arc in this movie. Because in the beginning of the movie, Meg is, I don't want to say shallow because that's not the right word, but she seems like the kind of person who a lot of people would view as being shallow. But as the movie goes on, there are certain aspects of her personality that get revealed, even to herself. Like, as the movie goes on, she becomes a much stronger person, and honestly becomes a freaking badass by the end of the movie. Now, even though he's not one of the main characters, I do want to point out the character of Paull Taylor, who is Meg's boyfriend in the beginning of the movie, because this is where the movie really did sort of subvert my expectations, because I saw the original The Blob before I saw this movie, and I thought this character was going to be the Steve Andrews equivalent, and he really wasn't, and I think Frank Darabont and Chuck Russell were kind of banking on you thinking that this guy was going to be one of the main characters. Jeffrey DeMunn is in this movie as the character of Herb Geller, who is the sheriff of Arborville in this movie, and he's actually a really likable character in this movie, which is why it's kind of a shame what happens to his character, but he's a character who I honestly would have liked to have seen more of. Like, he's a great character in this movie. And Jeffrey DeMunn, I think, is a phenomenal actor. He was also in movies like Christmas Evil and The Hitcher. And he would also go on to be in a lot of other Frank Darabont projects, like he had a very small role in The Shawshank Redemption. He also played Harry Terwilliger in The Green Mile. He played Dan Miller in The Mist, and he would also go on to play the character of Dale on the first 2 seasons of The Walking Dead. And I actually met Jeffrey DeMunn over a year ago at a Walking Dead convention, and I actually said I loved him in this movie, and he was actually kind of taken aback by that. Like, he wasn't angry by any means. Honestly, he was a really nice guy, but when I said I loved him in this movie, he was kind of taken aback. I don't know if maybe he's not proud of this movie or something, or maybe he was just surprised I would bring up this movie when this was a Walking Dead convention. At the same time, though, I also said I loved him as Harry Terwilliger in The Green Mile, and he was really flattered by that. In the movie, Del Close plays this crazed reverend who, when he sees the Blob, he thinks the Blob is actually a sign of Judgment Day. Like, he thinks the Blob is some kind of an avenging angel sent from heaven by God to punish mankind for his sins. And he gives this really chilling speech at the end of the movie about Judgment Day. And it's with this character where I sort of drew the comparison between this movie and Stephen King's The Mist. Now, Del Close actually was in Beware the Blob, however he played a completely different character in that movie. In the movie, Paul McCrane plays the sheriff's deputy, Deputy Briggs, and his character is a real dick in this movie. At the same time, though, he doesn't come off as a bad guy. Like, he actually comes off as a good cop. He's just kind of a hard-ass cop. Now, most people would probably recognize Paul McCrane from RoboCop, and I know he played a character on ER as well. In the movie, Joe Seneca, I have no idea if I'm saying his last name right, but he plays the character of Dr. Meadows, who is arguably the main human villain of the movie. Like, his character in this movie is so freaking creepy, especially because he doesn't come off as a bad guy at first, but when you find out what this guy's motives are, he's an evil bastard. And the thing about his character, though, is it seems like he genuinely thinks what he's doing is right, which arguably makes him an even scarier villain. I also want to point out that Bill Moseley has a very, very small role in this movie. Now, one thing I really do appreciate about this movie is they actually show you what it looks like to be eaten by the Blob. And the movie really does show that being eaten by this thing would be a horrible way to die, because the thing is essentially living acid, so you're literally being liquefied alive, and then the liquids that you melt into are being absorbed into this thing, which is how it grows bigger every time it eats. So, honestly, being eaten by the Blob is a really horrible death. Now, all that was implied in the first two Blob movies, but in this movie you actually see what it looks like to be eaten by this thing. And the Blob effects in this movie are actually really freaking cool looking. But yeah, the 1988 remake of The Blob is not just a fantastic remake, but it's just a fantastic horror film in general. And honestly, if you do count these three Blob movies as a franchise, I think this is easily the best film in the Blob franchise. Like, I might actually really like this better than the original film, and I love the original film. But once again, I really like this movie for a very different reason than I like the original The Blob. They are very different films, but personal taste-wise, I would say for me this is definitely the best film in the Blob franchise. And there is actually a lot of really clever satirical humor in this film. Like in the beginning of the film, when Meg, Paull, and Brian first take the old man to the hospital, the nurse is asking what kind of health insurance this guy has, even though that should not be her concern, considering he's literally being eaten by a monster. Obviously, the nurse doesn't know that yet, but, like, there's definitely a lot of, like, satirical humor in that scene. And also, later on in the movie, Meg's younger brother and his friend sneak into this slasher film, and the movie they're watching is a complete parody of, like, the Friday the 13th movies, so there is a lot of really clever satire in this film. And also, this movie does have a lot of sentimental value for me. I mean, I did grow up more with the original The Blob, but I did first see this movie when I was 12 years old, and I just absolutely fell in love with this movie the first time I saw it, and once again, I still really love the movie. Now, this movie did not do well when it came out, which is definitely a shame because this movie sets itself up for a sequel, and I would have loved to have seen a sequel to this movie. I think if it was done right, this movie could have had a kick-ass sequel. Now, unfortunately, there never was a sequel to this movie, but there has been talks of another Blob remake, and for the longest time, Rob Zombie was actually going to do another remake of The Blob, and apparently his take on The Blob was actually going to be quite different from anything we've ever seen before. But Rob Zombie dropped out of the project in 2015, and now the directing job has gone to Simon West, and I heard that Samuel Jackson is actually going to be in this next Blob remake. So we'll see what happens with this next Blob remake, and hopefully it's good. But yeah, that was my review on the 1988 remake of The Blob, and now that I'm done reviewing the Blob movies, my next movie review for Horror Month will be the 1976 film, The Omen. So stay tuned for that review, and bye.